Hello there, and welcome back to Teach Me in 10. In this episode, we'll be speaking with Katsia, who's a senior research scientist at the National Oceanography Centre, and we'll be discussing just how microplastics get into the deep ocean. So, let's get on into the video. Hi, thanks so much for joining us today. So, you're a scientist that's making waves in microplastic research. Could you tell us about your main areas of study and the goals driving your work in the field?
So for the past 10 years, I have been investigating microplastic pollution in the ocean, trying to answer the very fundamental questions about plastics. How much plastics are there in the oceans? What polymers are they? What sizes are they? Where do they go? Where do we find them? And where do these plastics ultimately end up? So, as I said, these are very fundamental questions that we need to answer in order to have realistic assessments of harms from plastics to marine ecosystems and to humans now and in the future. And this information is absolutely critical if we are to develop adequate mitigation strategies and actions or policies on production, use, and disposal of plastics, which our lives heavily depend on.
Fantastic. So we unfortunately often do see litter floating on the ocean surface, and that's known as macroplastics. But what does the breakdown process look like for these materials?
Indeed, a lot of plastics end up in the ocean, but only a fraction of them is actually floating in the surface, and this fraction is visible. And this is because sunlight, wind, waves, and seawater itself breaks down these larger plastics into much smaller particles, which are ultimately become invisible to a naked eye. So these very tiny plastics are called microplastics, and they tend to disperse into the ocean interior instead of floating in the surface.
Mm-hmm. So many people do assume that microplastics are buoyant, like larger floating plastics. Is this true, or are there factors that change their density and behaviour in seawater?
This is true. So most of plastic types are less dense than seawater, and therefore they are expected to float in the surface water rather than to sink. But we discovered that despite being buoyant, microplastics manage to escape into the ocean interior, and the quantities of these small plastics is much higher than the load of plastics, larger plastics that is actually floating in the surface ocean. And the number of processes that enable microplastics to enter the deep ocean. So this can be due to water mixing processes and hydrodynamic processes that are happening in the ocean. As you correctly mentioned, when in the marine environment, microplastics can change their density. And this can happen when microbes start living on the surfaces of plastics, and they form this layer called biofilm. So this makes the density of plastics higher, and they start sinking. Another process involves incorporation of microplastics into this natural flux of organic material, which is dense enough to sink on its own. So this material is called marine snow because it's so fluffy. So microplastics become part of it as well. Last but not least, another process involves microplastics being incorporated into a pool of zooplankton. So zooplankton are the tiny marine insects, so to say, which feed on microplastics. And as they adjust, microplastics become part of this pool, which is called fecal pellets. And these fecal pellets are also very, very dense, and they themselves sink to the seabed, carrying microplastics down.
So how exactly do microplastics travel to the deep ocean, and how long does it take for them to reach the abyss?
So this is a very, very good question, and we do not yet have an exact answer to this. So natural marine particles like marine snows and fecal pellets, they can travel as slow as 1 meter per day, or they can travel as fast as 500 meters a day, or even faster than that. It all depends on the density, size, and morphology of these particles. Now, one of the concerns of microplastics being incorporated in these organic flocks is that plastic is less dense material. So this ballasting can actually cause these natural particles to sink much slower than they otherwise would. And this poses huge implications to the quantities of carbon that these particles also transport to depth. And we are yet to find out how these two interact in the marine environment and what implications they have for sinking speeds of natural material as well as microplastics.
So you mentioned marine snow, but what role do organic particles like marine snow play in microplastics transport to the deep ocean?
So in a way, these natural material, they provide a means of transport for plastics to get from surface ocean into the deep ocean and ultimately into the marine sediment. And in a way, this is a nature's own mechanism to get rid of the pollution, which would otherwise most likely stay in the surface ocean.
So what technologies have really aided your research?
So we deploy a variety of ocean samplers to collect microplastics from very remote locations in the ocean. For example, we use pumping systems, which filter large volumes of water and allow us to measure microplastics concentrations at different depths in the ocean. We also deploy devices called sediment traps. So they are in a way like rain gauges, which sit at any depth in the ocean, in essence. We deploy them as deep as 3 kilometers deep. So they stay at that depth for about a year and collect everything that sinks down to that depth. All the particles, including microplastics. So with sediment traps, we can actually measure the daily rate of microplastics arrival to the abyssal ocean, and also determine what sort of sizes and polymer types are there. In terms of analytical techniques that we use, at NOC primarily we use Fourier transform infrared imaging, which allows us to detect and identify microplastics as small as about 10 microns, which is 7 times smaller than the width of a human hair. So it's very, very small. And we can also measure the sizes of these plastics, polymer types. If this particle is a bit larger, then we can also determine their shapes.
Incredible. So what's been the most surprising or unexpected outcome from your research so far?
So it was one of the discoveries that we made back in 2020 when the world knew very, very little about what's inside of the ocean in terms of plastic pollution. There was a belief that most of the plastic is actually floating. And what we have found out is that underneath the surface, there are a lot of small microplastics, and the loads of these plastics is much higher, not only in comparison to the larger plastics, but also to the amount that we have supposedly have put into the ocean since 1950s, when the use of these materials became very, very common. And we measured only 3 types of common plastics: polypropylene, polyethylene, and polystyrene. So they're also the most disposed ones. And we measured them at a very, very small size. And these are only, fractional amount that we can see in the ocean. And what we found out is plastic pollution, in essence, is like an iceberg. There is a lot more than we see in the surface. There's a lot more at depth, and we are yet to measure the full scale of the pollution.
Mm-hmm. It's pretty scary stuff. So are there any specific questions you're hoping to answer or challenges you're aiming to overcome in future research?
So plastic pollution is a very young research field, and there are a lot of unknowns around this topic. For example, I would be very interested in exploring what happens to plastic chemistry when plastics are in the marine environment, what happens in terms of the release of the components that are within plastics, and how other substances, including harmful substances that are already there in the ocean, absorb onto surfaces of microplastics or macroplastics. There is also a huge need to go smaller and being able to reliably measure plastics that are about 1,000 times smaller than microplastics. So they're called nanoplastics. And because they are so small and they also behave differently to microscopic particles, they are believed to be more pervasive and more harmful. And the harm would come from the fact that they're so small they can cross the biological boundaries, meaning they can cross the cell walls and accumulate in the organism.
Oh, perfect. Well, thank you ever so much for talking to us today. It's been fantastic.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for watching this episode, and I'm really happy to say that this episode was kindly brought to you by PerkinElmer. PerkinElmer is a trusted global leader in scientific solutions with an 80-plus-year history of bringing thought leadership, innovation, and technology to their customers to enable and accelerate scientific outcomes. Manufacturing the latest in analytical tools combined with expansive customer support services, PerkinElmer provides valuable insights to reshape the world for the better. Utilizing deep scientific knowledge and experience, they strive to provide the products, services, and expertise that matter the most in the laboratory. Please make sure to like and subscribe to Teach Me in 10, and we'll be sure to see you again very soon.